Good evening. On behalf of Princeton University and the Princeton University Press, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual Toni Morrison Lecture. This lecture was conceived by Eddie Glad, my colleague, to be one aspect of our continued and growing commitment to the study of the African American experience. The lectures are designed to spotlight the new and exciting work of scholars and writers who have risen to positions of prominence both in academia and in the broader world of letters. The lectures will be published by the Princeton University Press and are meant to celebrate the expansive literary imagination, intellectual adventurousness, and political insightfulness that characterize the writings of Toni Morrison. As such, it was an honor to be able to name the lecture series after our own Toni Morrison, who we share with the broader world. But Toni was an active member of our faculty for 17 years and continues to be an active member of our intellectual community. I'd like to welcome Toni and to thank her for her many contributions to the university and to thank her again for lending her name to this distinguished lecture series. Some of you will remember last year's lectures by Cornel West on the gift of black folk in the age of terrorism. Cornel and his lectures set a high standard for this series. But having read recently tonight's speaker's powerful book, Brother, I'm Dying, I have no doubt that Edward Danticat will maintain the high standard that Cornel set in his lecture last year. Let me say a few words about the Center for African American Studies at Princeton, which is sponsoring this lecture series. I am in the fortunate position of being a neighbor of the center, and I've been impressed for the last 2 years at the flurry of activity that started when the center began and that's come to our neighborhood in the last year when we've lived nearby. And by just the rich assortment of intellectual activity that's been offered to the university community in the past years. The faculty committee that proposed the center conceived it as a center of activity on campus, and indeed the center has more than fulfilled this mission, hosting a variety of symposia, conferences, lectures, and artistic performances. I encourage you all, if you don't routinely do this, to review their offerings from time to time, because beyond this esteemed lecture, there are many things going on that are of interest to our community. Now I would like to introduce Professor Valerie Smith, the director of the Center for African American Studies, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Val is the Woodrow Wilson Professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton. She joined our faculty in 1982, and except for a brief period at UCLA, has been on our faculty since. Val is a respected scholar whose research and teaching focus on African American literature and culture, Black feminist theory, autobiography, Black film, and 20th century US literature. Val has served the university in a number of roles over time, most recently as the director of the Center for African American Studies since its founding. Val.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Center for African American Studies and Princeton University Press, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second annual Toni Morrison Lecture. Let me begin by thanking Louie Rooks, the Associate Director, Carla Penn, Center Manager, Jennifer Losi, the events coordinator, and Tiffany Johnson, our student intern, for the hard work that they put in order to organize this event and to make this possible. As David mentioned a moment ago, in naming this series in honor of Professor Morrison, we pay tribute to her stature as one of the most gifted, influential, and versatile artists of her own or any time. Her writing combines innovations in narrative form, elegance of expression, and a reverence for history with an unflinching political courage. This series is our way of acknowledging that the future of African American studies at Princeton, in the academy, and throughout the world will forever be shaped by her generous embrace of diverse artistic and cultural forms, her commitment to social justice, and the standard of excellence she has set, upheld, and embodied. So thank you, Toni, for allowing us to continue to celebrate your magnificent talent and incomparable contributions to public life in this way. Now, also, as David mentioned a moment ago, many of you were here last year with us when Cornel West, class of 1943 university professor in the Center for African American Studies, graced, inspired, and challenged us with the inaugural lectures, The Gifts of Black Folk in the Age of Terrorism. Again, Cornel, we are so grateful to you for being with us to pass on this legacy to this year's speaker, so thank you again so much for being here. But this year we are enormously fortunate that Edwidge Danticat, one of the most prodigiously gifted writers of her generation, has agreed to deliver the second annual Morrison Lecture. Edwidge Danticat was born in Haiti. When she was 12, she joined her parents in Brooklyn, to which they had immigrated years before. She holds an undergraduate degree in French literature from Barnard College and an MFA from Brown University. Edwidge Danticat is a stunningly prolific writer whose work explores the nuanced, intimate, and ambiguous ways in which political upheaval and the disruptions of diasporic movement shape the lives of the disfranchised. Eloquent in 3 languages, Creole, French, and English, she infuses her writing with the rich narrative traditions of her Haitian ancestors, who, she has written, blended the European languages of their enslavers with African dialects to invent a language from which colorful phrases blossomed to fit their desperate circumstances. Edwidge Danticat is the author of 4 exquisitely wrought, critically acclaimed works of fiction: Breath, Eyes, Memory, 1994, Crick, Crack, Stories, 1995, which was a National Book Award finalist, The Farming of Bones, 1999, an American Book Award winner, and The Dewbreaker, 2004. She's the editor of The Butterfly's Way, Voices from the Haitian Diaspora in the United States, and The Beacon Best of 2000, Great Writing by Men and Women of All Colors and Cultures. And she served as associate producer of 2 films, Courage and Pain and The Agronomist. Moreover, she's the author of 2 works of nonfiction, After the Dance, A Walk Through Jacmel, Haiti, 2002, and most recently, the eloquent, unflinching, haunting memoir entitled Brother, I'm Dying, which was also a National Book Award finalist. Whether in her creative work or in her activist commitments, Edwidge Danticat has been a tireless advocate for the rights of immigrants caught between totalitarian regimes at home and harsh treatment and policies abroad. Critics and reviewers have often compared her work to Toni Morrison's. As the writer Robert Antoni has written, Edwidge Danticat is, quote, doing for Haiti's history of violence and vengeance what Toni Morrison did for the US in tackling the horrors of slavery and its aftermath. Her subject, he adds, is partly exile and the impossibility of surrendering memories or of taking root completely because of them. This evening, Edwidge Danticat will speak to us on the subject, Create Dangerously, the Immigrant Artist at Work. And after her lecture, there will be some time for questions and comments from the audience. Given the emotional clarity, elegance of expression, and courage that characterize all of her work, my colleagues and I could think of no one better suited to deliver this year's Morrison Lecture than Edwidge Danticat. We are grateful to you for taking the time to be with us, and we want to welcome you back to Princeton. Thank you.
Good evening and One. In the Haitian countryside, in greeting, we say One, and the response is respect, which is both this honor and respect. So I greet you tonight in both honor and respect. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for such a kind and generous introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. There are times when you're called to do something so extraordinary that you're not fully aware of yourself as you say yes. You know, the call comes, it's the second annual Toni Morrison Lecture Series, and we pick a date. And only when the time comes to schedule travel do I realize that it's my precious daughter's 3rd birthday. But then, as I think about it, then I realize that the marriage of these two events, if you will, can give me a bit of much-needed courage. If I can do 16 hours of labor, as I did 3 years ago, maybe I can also rise to this extraordinary occasion. Still, I'm counting on all of you to keep my secret, because if not, later you might have to suffer through a memoir called Create Dangerously, How My Mother Delivered Her Toni Morrison Lecture on my 3rd birthday. Before I begin, I want to thank everyone at the Center for African American Studies, and to Fred Appel from Princeton University Press, to Jennifer Losi, who did everything but physically carry me here tonight. I thank you very much. I'd like to thank my mother and my husband, my friend Nicole and Robin, who traveled a long way to be here tonight. And of course, I would like to thank Ms. Morrison. Thank you for your work, for your genius, for all the gates you have opened for all of us. Thank you so much. And One to Dr. Cornell West. It is with great humility that I follow you tonight. In the beginning was the Word, and perhaps the Word, or the words were, once upon a time, il était une fois, or even cric-crac. So please allow me to begin by telling you a true but sad story. On November 12, 1964, in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, a huge crowd gathered to watch an execution. The president of Haiti then was the dictator, François Duvalier, Papa Doc. And on the day of the execution, he had ordered all government offices closed so that hundreds of state employees could be present. Schools in the capital were also closed so that children could come to watch. And people living outside, people living in a place that we in Haiti call the pays en dehors, the outside country, these people were bussed into the inside country to fill out the crowd for this execution. Now the two men to be executed were Marcel Numa and Louie Dwin. Marcel Numa was 21 years old, and he was the son of a coffee planter from a beautiful southern town called Jérémie, a place that in Haiti we call the City of Poets because it has per capita the most Haitian poets. Marcel Numa was from a family of poets, and one of his uncles had actually adapted Pierre Corneille's Le Cid, placing it in a Haitian setting. The second man to be executed that day was Louie Duan. Louie Duan was 31 years old, and he was also from Jérémie. He had served in the U.S. Army. He was a very good writer. He published in a journal called L'Ambi, which was translated as Conch. And Marcel Numa and Louie Duan had been childhood friends in the City of Poets and had remained friends when their parents, their families moved them to the United States, to Queens, the city of different kinds of poets. Now in Queens, the two men had joined a group called Jeune Haïti, or Young Haiti, and they became 2 of 13 young Haitian Americans who left the U.S. in early 1964 to engage in a guerrilla war that they hoped would topple the dictatorship. The men of Jeune Haiti spent 3 months fighting in the hills and the mountains of Haiti, and all of them died in battle except these 2. And after months of chasing them down, Papa Doc wanted to make a spectacle of their deaths. So on the morning of November 12, 1964, the firing squad did its brutal work. Blood was splattered onto a wall. Blood onto the wall being the collaborative art of dictators and their henchmen, and the two men were forever silenced. Or were they? All artists, writers among them, have their own creation myths, their beginning of life stories, if you will. Theirs was one of mine. Like a lot of creation myths, it involves one, a disobeyed directive, and two, a brutal punishment as a result. Now let me explain. If you think back to the beginning, Adam, father, and Eve, mother, disobeyed, and they were banished from Eden. The directive was, don't eat the apple. The punishment was exile. Now, had execution been chosen for them rather than exile, then there would have never been another story told. There would be no story to pass on. Incidentally, in his play Caligula, which will play a very significant role in the way Marcel, Numa, and Louie Duan were eventually remembered, Albert Camus' Caligula says that it doesn't matter whether one is exiled or executed, but it's important that the creator, the superior being, has the right of choosing. Creation myths, or beginning of life tales, like most creation myths, this one too is beyond the scope of my own lifetime, yet it feels very present to me for several reasons. Marcel and Louie were children of migration who had returned to the homeland in the hope of saving it. And second, in the propaganda preceding their execution, Papa Doc Duvalier had framed them not as immigrants who had returned or as exiled, but as what we call in Haiti as blanc, and blanc being white, people being white, but also meaning foreigner, so that even in their dying, they were doubly exiled. Now, the reaction to this execution was swift outside of the country. Time magazine, among other US publications, wrote a damning article. But within Haiti itself, there was mostly the state media running pictures of this over and over again. If you went to the movies, before the cinema, before the film was shown, you would watch this execution. And at the time of the execution, my uncle and my father and my mother all lived in a neighborhood about 30 minutes from the cemetery called Bel Air. And the neighborhood had a study center where young men and women came to study en masse. If you didn't have electricity in your house, you could go to the center and you could study. And anyone who's ever heard young people who study, as we do in Haiti by rote memorization, it's like Gregorian chant. It's like an intellectual meditation. Christophe Colomb a découvert Haïti en 1492. Christophe Colomb a découvert Haïti. And what I'm saying is Christopher Columbus discovered Haiti in 1492. So the simplest narration of a narrative, the simplest manifestation or stating of it, and this kind of singing. And this is what they were supposed to be doing in the center. But some of them also belonged to a book club that was run by the Alliance Française, the French Institute of Port-au-Prince. And the book club was called Le Club de Bonne Humeur, the Good Humor Club, not the ice cream. But at the time of these executions, some of them were reading Camus, they were reading Caligula, with an eye to staging this play. Now, we're not talking about a rich area here. We're not talking about rich or even middle-class people. This neighborhood is a place that recently somebody called the Fallujah of Haiti, the Baghdad of Haiti. But they were reading this play which tells the story of a young prince who rises to the highest post in Rome. And then, just as Papa Doc had risen from a country doctor from very modest beginning to the highest post in his country, and in the play, Caligula loses his sister, who is also his lover, and then just loses his mind. And Papa Doc had just at that point where he was unraveling, had been an attempt on the life of his son, and then everyone started to suffer more. In his introduction to this play, Camus writes, "I have little regard for an art that deliberately aims to shock because it is unable to convince." Now, these young men and women of the Club des Bonnes Humeurs, they were already in shock. You know, you can imagine, they were already shocked. What they needed was convincing. Convincing, as Camus put it, and create dangerously, the essay from which this talk borrows its title. They needed convincing that, quote, on the deck of slave galleys, it is possible to sing, that it is possible to record the social conversation that takes place on the benches of the amphitheater where the lion is crushing the victim. End quote. In other words, they needed these young men and women, some of them who had been forced to witness an execution and were being forced to witness it over and over, watching these men die and over at the cinema, on television. They needed convincing that art could still be created even in their circumstances, especially, if you will, in their circumstances. They needed convincing that words could still be written, that songs could still be sung, that pictures could still be drawn, that stories could still be told. So as my father used to tell it, they put on these white sheets as togas and they'd stage the play in one of their houses, but they did it quietly. Now the legend of this secret staging of the play was so strong that years after Papa Dog died, every time there was a political murder in Bel Air, the neighborhood where I spent the first 12 years of my life, some brave person would always say, we should put on a play. And because my uncle Joseph, who raised me between the age of 4 and 12, where my parents were in New York, because he was a minister and had a big backyard, they were staging of these plays in the back of the church, sort of shrouded as youth meetings. And this need to be quiet was so strong that I recently wrote an entire book that in part dealt with his life. And I tell you, I was too afraid to even say that because I was thinking of people who were reading not from outside the culture, but from inside the culture, that they might read this and say, oh my God, he was a troublemaker and deserved to die, as he did in matters related to this. There were many repeats of this story, though, throughout the entire country with different pieces of literature. Sometimes the plays that were put on were by living Haitian writers who, because they couldn't produce freely their own work, went to the Greeks and adapted them. When it was a crime to pick up a body on the street, they staged Antigone, which had been rewritten in Creole by a poet named Félix Morisseau-Louie, a writer who died in the United States a couple of years ago. When exile suddenly loomed for a lot of them, they staged Medea. And this is where these writers found their balance between silence and art, between, as in the creation myth, edging too close towards that choice between banishment and execution. I sometimes like to think that they were honoring the feminine by staging Antigone or Medea, but they might have also been putting another layer of protection between themselves and the censors, who might see a woman's name and think that this is just a girly play. Create dangerously. How do writers and readers find each other in such dangerous circumstances? And the example of these Haitian writers who adopted the Greeks to their circumstances, they acknowledged that they could only reach the reader by extending them that layer of protection, which as readers themselves, they already needed because they had had to burn and bury their books after watching their friends being hauled off to jail for owning them. Reading as writing under these circumstances is a disobeyed directive in which the reader, our Eve, already knows the consequences of eating that apple, but she takes that bite anyway. How does that reader find the courage to take the bite, open that book, after an arrest, after a murder, after an execution? Of course, she finds it in the power of the hushed chorus of other readers, but she also finds it in the writer's courage. Create dangerously for people who read dangerously. Because of my creation myths and my particular background, this is what I've always thought it meant to be a writer. Writing, knowing in part that somewhere, someone might one day risk his or her life to read you. Ms. Morrison in The Dancing Mind talks about that writer-reader when she describes how at a meeting concerning persecuted writers, a woman walked up to her in Strasbourg, a woman writer who approached her in tears and said, "You have to help us. There isn't anybody else." Coming where I come from, with the history I have, this is what I've always seen as the unifying principle between writers. This is what joins Albert Camus to Toni Morrison, James Baldwin to Sophocles, the Russian Osip Mandelstam to Alice Walker, Euripides to that woman writer in Strasbourg asking for help. Somewhere, if not now, then maybe years into the future, a future we might have yet to dream of, someone might risk his or her life to read us. Somewhere, if not now, then maybe in the future, a future we might all have yet to dream of, we might also save someone's life because they have given us a passport, making us honorary citizens of their culture. This is why when I wrote a book called The Dew Breaker, which is set around the period of these executions, I used an epigraph from a poem by the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, who famously said that only in Russia is poetry respected because it gets people killed. The quote I used from one of his poems was, "Maybe this is the beginning of madness. Forgive me for what I'm saying. Read it quietly, quietly, quietly." Reading and writing quietly, dangerously, is not only a solitary, but a solidary act. There are so many possible interpretations of what it means to create dangerously, and Camus does a great job giving us his as creating with a sense of political responsibility and creating as a revolt against silence, and I completely agree. But my creation myths and my childhood have taught me that it also means creating when both the creation and the reception, the writing and the reading, can be considered a criminal act. Of course, this is not my reality now. Not yet anyway. You know, we never know with the Patriot Act and the way these spying things are going. But I am an immigrant. And if I were a braver woman, I might even tell you that there is no such thing as an immigrant writer in this globalized age where Algeria and Haiti and even ancient Egypt and Greece are only a virtual visit away. Even without globalization, the writer, bound to the reader under diabolic or even joyful circumstances, lives in the heart and in the country of his readers. And even beyond the world of art, if you all recall these headlines the morning after September 11, starting with Le Monde saying, "Nous sommes tous des Américains," we are all Americans. My friend, the Haitian writer Dany Laferrière, who was a journalist during the Duvalier regime and was forced to leave Canada during the dictatorship, will soon publish a book called I Am a Japanese Writer. Dany tends to have very interesting titles for his books. You know, his first novel was called Comment faire l'amour avec un nègre sans se fatiguer, How to Make Love to a Negro Without Getting Tired. But Je suis un écrivain japonais is a different book altogether. And that he talks about the intimate marriage that is their union. Is there really a border between a writer and his or her reader? Is there really a border between Antigone's desire to bury her brother and the Haitian mother of 1964 who desperately wants to take her dead son's body out of the street to give him a proper burial, knowing that if she does that, she too is going to die? So after these executions, when these young men and women were reading Caligula, Camus became a Haitian writer. When they were reading Antigone, Sophocles became a Haitian writer. And when they were reading Medea, Euripides became a Haitian writer. The only reason I may not go as far as my friend Dany and say that all writers belong completely to the land of their readers is that right now you cannot simply tell the Immigration Service, the men and women of the Customs and Department of Homeland Security, that listen, I don't have a green card, but I am a writer and I belong here because all writers belong to the land of their readers and I'm read in America. And even if you have a passport that says you're an American, You cannot always make that claim for yourself either. And you certainly cannot make it for loved ones, as I found out when my Uncle Joseph, the minister, the one who had the plays staged in the backyard of his church, when he had to flee another turbulent period in Haiti and arrived at the airport in Miami and requested asylum and told the Department of Homeland Security people that he had a niece who was a writer and had a U.S. passport and was living 15 minutes away, it did not make a bit of difference. At 81 years old, Uncle Joseph was arrested, put in prison, and he died 3 days later. During that whole time, I kept thinking to myself, somebody should surely put on a play about this. The immigrant artist needs to put on that play that ponders death, various forms of death. The death that brought us here, the deaths that keep us here, the executions at home, the deaths in exile, the deaths at the gatekeeper's hands, and all the deaths in between. The death that renders a reluctant emigre like my Uncle Joseph a perpetual exile because it was too dangerous on November 12, 2004, exactly 40 years after the death of Marcel, Numa, and Louie. It was too dangerous for us, even after my uncle had been deathly rejected by this country. It was too dangerous for us to return to our own country, to bury his body there. The immigrant artist at work ponders death the way they did in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Macondo at that beginning. We have not still had a death, Marquez's colonel says. A person does not belong to a place until someone is dead under the ground. And the colonel's wife's reply, I think, might have been the same as my uncle. If I have to die for the rest of you to stay here, she says, then I will die. Today in the United States of America, the immigrant artist at work, to borrow again from Ms. Morrison, knows what it is to live at the edge of towns that cannot bear our company. To live in a country that needs our labor but wants our children banned from its schools, our sick shut from its hospital. A country that wants our elderly, after a lifetime of working here, to just pick up and go off somewhere else to die. A country that has a deportation operation which separates parents from children, which it calls return to sender. If I have to die for the rest of you to stay here, says the colonel's wife, then I will die. Like her, the immigrant artist must quantify the price of the American dream in flesh and bone. All this while living with more normal fears. Do I have enough? Do I know enough about where I've come from? Do I know enough about where I am? Even if somebody has died for me, will I ever be allowed to belong? Camus said in one of his essays, one of his lyrical essays, the book is actually called Lyrical and Critical Essays, that a person's art is a slow trek to rediscover those 2 or 3 images in whose presence his or her heart first opened. My 3 images so far are the deaths of Marcel Numa and Louie Duan and thousands of others to the dictatorship, listening to stories at my grandmother's knee, and the deaths of my father and uncle. And each of these images are several cities, 2 countries, 2 nations who are the first independent republics in this hemisphere, but whose goals and destinies were obviously very different. The immigrant artist shares with all other artists the desire to remake a world, even as that world is full of xenophobia, sexism, racism, and just plain meanness. When, for example, my uncle was dying in immigration jail, and my father was also dying of lung disease at the same time that my daughter, who is 3 today, was being born, when all of this was happening, there were just moments when writing the op-eds for the newspaper about the way my uncle had died, I really wanted some artistic sovereign to excuse me. I wanted to ask permission to excuse myself. Can I just please be the daughter, I wanted to say, the niece, the mother-to-be. But remember, on the deck of slave galleys, they sang, They recorded the social conversation on the benches of the amphitheater as the lions crunched the victim. Of course, I cannot excuse myself. The fabric is weaved too tight. Even when we think we can rend it, we can't. So though we are not creating as dangerously as our forebears, though we are not risking, not yet, this kind of execution, though torture and beating and exile does not threaten us into perpetual silence, still, while we are at work, people's faces are being pushed into pools of water, and we are asking ourselves whether or not they are being tortured. While we are at work, people who think they're getting on a plane to visit loved ones are secretly intercepted and flown to offshore torture chambers. While we are at work, people are being held indefinitely without the benefit of a phone call. While I was at work, my uncle requested asylum and died. While I am at work, children are eating medicinal clay in the shape of cookies to quench their hunger in the very neighborhood where I grew up. Unless you think me melodramatic, the Associated Press recently published an article about people eating this medicinal clay in Haiti. And there was a picture of a child who sticks out with his dirt-coated tongue, just as all children are prone to stick out their tongues if asked. And people did call me and said, "Edwige, why are you sitting around writing stories while your people are eating dirt?" And when my uncle was dying in immigration custody, some well-meaning people called me and said, "Well, what's the use of being this kind of writer you are if you can't even get your uncle out of jail?" And what could I say? Perhaps this is why we need to feel that we are creating dangerously as writers who are not scribbling on prison walls, who have not yet had our faces pushed into that pool of water. People who have not yet had to pack our belongings in the middle of the night and fled. Self-doubt is probably one of the stages of acclimation into a new culture. It's the staple for most artists. As immigrant artists for whom so much has been sacrificed, so many dreams have been deferred, we already doubt so much. It might have been simpler, safer to become the doctors, lawyers, and engineers our parents wanted us to be. Perhaps I might have come up with a solution to the medicinal cookie as food problem. When the work stalls and we can't write or paint or sing, we tell ourselves how right they might have been our elders about these risky professions. Who do we think we are? Well, we think we are people who risk not existing at all, people who might have had a mother or father killed even before we were born. Some of us are accidents of literacy. I am. People who might not have been able to go to school at all, who might have never learned to read and write. We think we are children of people who have lived too long in the shadows, like many undocumented people who've died in national tragedies, and because they were in this country without papers and they were never claimed. We think we are like many of the young immigrant soldiers fighting in Iraq who only get their citizenship posthumously. You see, there's usually a backlog and only death puts you on the fast track. We think, how come in this country we are so much like the ancient Egyptians, whose gods of death demand documentation of worthiness and acceptance before they allow a century? Let us hope that we are also like them in the way of their artists and in their art. One of the many ways a sculpture in ancient Egypt was described was as one who keeps things alive. Before pictures were drawn and amulets were carved for ancient Egyptian tombs, wealthy men and women had their slaves buried with them to keep them company in death. The artist who came up with this other type of memorial art to replace the dead bodies saved lives. We must create as boldly and as dangerously as they. We must create as though each piece of art is a stand-in for a life, a soul, a dream, a hope, a future. As that woman writer in Strasbourg said, and as those ancient Egyptian sculptures surely must have believed, as Marcel Numa and Louie Dwin surely knew, there isn't anybody else. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I think if there are questions. Yes.
How's that? Better?
Yes, Gwen.
How our government could let Mr. Aristide be taken away from his country where he'd been well received by his countrymen and voted in as president, and taken off somewhere and just dropped like I don't know what. And I'm still mad about it. And there was something the other day that said that George Stephanopoulos and Tavis Smiley were both going to interview him before he went away, and they took him away. And I think they're the kind of people that would introduce him to a lot of people that did not know about Aristide. And I'm still mad, and that's it.
Well, there are a lot of people who are still mad with you. I think it's Randall Robinson wrote an incredible book about this. The title is escaping me now. An Unbroken Agony, where he has inside information. He had traveled to the Central African Republic to visit the Aristides, and but at the time that this all happened to President Aristide, it was 2004, and it was the 200-year anniversary of Haitian independence, and there were many things. And he had one of the reasons I think that a lot of people think this happened. It was first a way for the United States and the French to make up after this whole French freedom fries business. And then Mr. Aristide had a campaign going where there was a clock going where he was demanding reparations from the French for monies that had been paid to the French for our liberty, for our independence. And so there were many things going beyond the fact that the Americans had never liked President Aristide, and there was a vocal pro-Aristide, but also a very anti-Aristide demonstration stirring. But there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are happy he left, but there are a lot of people also who are very angry and sad, like you, that he was taken that way. Hello. Well, I think if I didn't believe in that, I wouldn't have chosen this subject. I think married into the idea, the idea of creating, artists always find a way around these obstacles, like these men who rewrote these plays and set them in our situation. It was the only way they could talk about this situation, by going far into the past. And I think it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be a writer. It's a blessing. It's a privilege. It's a great gift. And and it's also in the communities that I come from. It's not just your gift; it's a gift that you share with the community, which is why it's doubly wonderful to stand here under the banner of Ms. Morrison's name, because you feel a sense of continuity. That's a blessing, I think, for the person who receives it, but also gives us a charge to pass on. I think there. I think, Brother, I'm Dying, my recent book, I feel like is special because it is, as I mentioned, it talks about my Uncle Joseph, it talks about my father, it talks about my daughter, sort of how my uncle and father leaving the world at the same time that my daughter entered into it. And I do feel, when I was writing that book, especially in the way my uncle died, it was certainly, I feel like everything up to that point had been training for it, and that now they needed my voice for this story. Like my uncle needed my voice, my father needed my voice. Because one of the things that happened to also the immigrant non-artist, the immigrant father, like my father, who worked so hard his whole life, what started happening as he lay dying is that he started really doubting that he had done anything with his life. He just worried that it had not meant very much. And this book, I felt as I was writing it, I was almost visiting with them. And I was able to go back and reconstruct things that I had taken for granted in both their lives. So it is a very special book for me. Oh, the balcony, okay. Are the Cuban doctors still working in Haiti? They certainly are, as far as I know. Yes. Okay.
This is very strange having a microphone, but I am a master's student, and I'm currently writing my thesis on your work. And I was having tremendous writer's block, and one of my thesis committee members said, she sent me an email, and she said, FYI, Danticat is speaking at Princeton, and you should go there. And I said, I don't have any money, but I am here. So I've been on a train all day, my brain is fried, but how timely is it that you were talking today? And my thesis is due in about a month. So I have some questions.
Maybe we should do email.
We should.
Thank you.
I'll email you. First of all, I'm just incredibly nervous to be speaking to someone who I'm writing my thesis on. That's kind of strange. But I wanted to ask you, you talked about creating and writing for people who, for them, the process of reading and speaking could be a dangerous process. How much of your writing is also educational for people who are still ignorant about the situation in Haiti, for people who are still ignorant about the part that the U.S. played in Haiti's situation today? How much of it is for those people as well as the people who are still in Haiti and the aspiring writers and the thesis people as well? Thank you.
I don't know. I think that at the core of this too, this kind of creation is that I don't think Sophocles thought he was writing for the Haitians. You know what I mean? I don't think we know where it will land. So it's for everybody, who has an encounter with it, who is open enough to have an encounter with it. And I think that's what literature does, that it gives us a passport into a culture. What I hope when people read me is that then they'll go and find out more about Haiti, because there's so many, especially in the entertainments of this country, and then the media of this country, so many misconceptions about Haiti. And so I hope if somebody reads a story, okay, if they're mildly entertained by it, also that it encourages a kind of curiosity in them, that they'll go out and learn more. So I don't think any writer really knows where the work will land. So it's for everybody.
And pieces of literature that were also inspiration for you, or pieces of literature that had a major sort of formative effect, if you will, on the way you perceived things and the way you then now have interpreted those things going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think because it wasn't, as I mentioned, where I grew up, if you owned a book, or if you had maybe 4 books at a time in your house, 2 were owned by somebody else, and we were on a rotation. So definitely, sort of these plays. There was the Antiguanian Creole, which was passed around, and there was the Caligula, but I thought at first you thought it was kind of a myth, because it's more of a story than a text. And then there was the book. A very important book for me was a book called Gouverneur de la Rosée, Masters of the Dew, by a writer named Jacques Roumain, who was extraordinarily good friends with Langston Hughes and Mercer Cook. And actually, Langston Hughes and Mercer Cook translated Gouverneur de la Rosée into English. There was much in there. The period of the Harlem Renaissance was very inspiring to Jacques Roumain, and he would write poems about Harlem without ever being here, from his encounters with Langston and other friends. And he was one of the first people. He was a middle class Haitian man, but he was one of the first people who wrote about the countryside. And I remember reading that book and thinking, this is the first time I had read about the countryside in a book. And you'd find this ironic that even I didn't read Haitian literature. We weren't taught, when I was in school in Haiti, Haitian literature in school. We were taught French literature. So I didn't really read Haitian literature until I came to New York. In Brooklyn, at the Brooklyn Public Library, they had these little shelves of Haitian books. So I didn't, we had what people read, what was taught at that time was all French literature. So that I thought, until, for a good chunk of my very early life, I thought that to be a writer, you had to be French, and you had to be a man, and you had to be dead. That's what a writer was supposed to be.
I have one more question up here.
I'm a student here at the university, and I would like to major in creative writing. And I came from a fairly pedestrian background. I'm from the Chicago suburbs, but I'm very interested.
That's not pedestrian.
But I'm very interested in the ways that art can advance human rights, and very sincerely interested in that. But sometimes I wonder, in trying to address those kinds of issues in my work, if there isn't a certain hubris in that, in trying to address issues that affect people in a culture that isn't your own, and people who have experienced pain that far transcends anything that you've ever experienced. And there's a Toni Morrison quote, where there's pain, there are no words, all pain is the same, but sometimes I don't know if that's true. Sometimes I think it is, sometimes I doubt it, I don't know.
Oh, we end with the easy question, huh? I mean, I think only you have to find that answer for yourself. I would first look at the pain in your own background. I would look at the complexities and what there is that you have been through, because I think that we have to address that before you can move to somebody else's pain, because sometimes maybe it seems too easy. In order to avoid being a voyeur, you have to know how to feel at the deepest level for your own experience, I believe, before you can know what somebody else feels. But ultimately, you'll have to, as we all do, immigrant artists or not, will have to answer that question for yourself. Thank you so very much, all.